So let's talk about George Costanza. So describe the character of George.
Oh, golly. Certainly, George is a neurotic personality. He lives a bit in a frenzy. He has a questionable character and questionable integrity. Um, he is certainly ready, willing, able to spin a lie or a fantasy if he needs to embellish himself or his image or protect himself. Um, he has an overinflated ego coupled with a sort of crippling self knowledge of his relative lack of talents or uniqueness. Um, and but it's all in a balance that I've not seen in a character other than him. Um, and in some way, his knowledge of his own complete dysfunction is charming. I actually find him a really charming character because he is able at times to step back and go, "Oh my God, I'm a mess. I'm a mess." And what I hear from people all the time, more than any other character on the show, is we know a George. We know a George. George is the guy we know in our lives.
Did you have input into that character?
Any actor in a series is going to have input into the character. I did not have input into stories. And sometimes I was surprised by the turns that his choices would make or his personality would make. But I never did anything as George that I didn't believe in or that I thought was completely wrong for him. And with anybody doing a role for year after year after year, it fleshes out in ways that are subtle and profound as time goes on. I can look at the show now and see myself as young George and going, yeah, I didn't know that much about him back then. I was doing Woody or I was doing Larry, but by the time we get into season 4 and 5, now I'm doing George. And he starts to have more facets and more colors, and it's just so in that way, yes. I mean, nobody ever came up with the snort laugh. Nobody ever wrote, nobody ever did that. Nobody wrote in the visual takes or the behavioral takes. They wrote the lines. So everything other than the dialogue itself or the choices the character makes, it came from me.
And how you mentioned the differences in George in later seasons. How did he evolve?
Well, George got more successful in many ways over the seasons. So he had a Seinfeld show produced he was an executive producer on Jerry, the series. He got his dream. He worked for the Yankees. He was Steinbrenner's go-to guy in many ways. He had a girlfriend for a year. He was a fiance for a year. My wife would always say to me, "How are you getting these girls?" They would always cast kind of wonderful women for me to work with that, George would never get these girls. This is somebody's TV fantasy. But all those situations over time matured him, and you just find out more about them. I've had people say, "Oh, you were so smart to base your performance on your parents in the show." And I went, they showed up in season 4. The parents were cast off of what we were doing, not the other way around. You're right. The parents, once they were there, I learned so much about George because of how Jerry and Estelle approach those roles. And you go, okay, now I have the world of how was he treated as a kid, and what would ring his bells, and what. Up until then, you don't know. So the more information you get, the richer the character becomes.
How did George get his name?
George Costanza? I couldn't tell you. I know Jerry had a friend whose last name was either Costanza or Costanzo, and that friend of his claims that the character was based on him. I said, well, that's interesting because I didn't meet you until I think we were in year 7. But other than that, I don't know. I mean, George is a great kind of second banana name, that's for sure.
So, in what ways were you, are you, or were you like George, and what ways are you different?
It's a question I get asked all the time. I don't think I'm anything like George. I really don't. I think if you're like George, it's hard to play George. I think it has to come from an observer's point of view. You can't understand that dichotomy of ego if you are consumed by either half of it. So I am neither consumed by worthlessness, nor am I consumed by, a hubristic view of myself. I don't have his neuroses. I don't have his willingness to confront. I understand his duplicity. I don't always have the courage to try it the way he would. I'm a far duller person than George was. I always had to notch up to play George. So I think we're very different. Left to my own devices, I'm not even as interesting as Jason Alexander out in the world. I had to kind of not manufacture, but allow a personality to emerge that wasn't organic to me in order to be able to be a publicly recognized person. Because I'm very shy, somewhat introverted, not terribly fun. I don't shoot for the funny. I shoot for direct and honest and interesting and compelling. But I don't think, oh, I better pepper this with a few laughs because my friends are around. So I wouldn't have been a very good functioning celebrity in the real world, in the way that many actors are not, that are introverted or shy or whatever, that protective. And because of the kinds of characters I play, I realize how distancing my own persona would be to someone who had only seen me in those personas. They would think I was copying an attitude. So I had to find a way to kind of allow myself to go into a funnier head and a more gregarious head. I enjoy people. I'm not an introvert in that way. I enjoy people. But it's when I walk out my door, especially in the year 2013, I know the world's a camera. And my business is selling to that audience. They're my buyers. I can't have a bad day with them. I can't tell them to blow off when they want an autograph. I can't hold their feet to the fire when they're being inappropriate with me or intrusive. I have to communicate in some way that there are boundaries, but I can't hurt my buyer. I can't do that to people. So I've had to find ways to be me, but be Jason, not Jay.
So, as Seinfeld became popular, what were people saying to you when they would approach you on the street?
Oh, it was always loving, but often intrusive. For an introvert to go to the supermarket and have somebody go, "George, can't stand ya," and have heads turn and go, Don't make me the center of attention. Oh, I'm just shopping for peas. I just want a can of corn. Now I'm on. It's horrifying. But I knew that it was being done out of excitement and enthusiasm, and so it was a really odd transition. Now, fortunately, it was slow because the move of the show being an obscure failure to being this thing it became was gradual enough that we could take it in stride. But I remember very well, I think we were late in our third season, and I was doing an interview for Entertainment Tonight, and they were shooting B-roll. So it's just we're walking on the sidewalk in my neighborhood, and a van drives by. It's an African-American family in a van, and a girl who looks to be about 9 years old shoots her hat out the window and goes, "I love you, George." And I went, what is she watching? How is she, 8 years old, black, Los Angeles, which is not New York, not a Jew, I'm sure not a Jew, not Italian, which are the only things that kind of match the energy of the four of us. What is she watching and laughing at on our show? And George, no less. I understand Kramer. Kramer falls down. Kramer makes faces. George blew my mind. I went, we're starting to get an audience that I can't account for. And that audience started to be more and more vocal and present in my everyday life, you know, airports, markets, movies.
Who did you think the Seinfeld audience was?
Me. And that's what I said to Jerry when we did the pilot, and he said, "What do you think?" You know, I said, "I don't think so." He said, "You don't think it's good?" I said, "No, I think it's terrific. That's the problem. I'm your audience, a white guy, Jewish Italian, but Jewish Italian, who lives in a big city, preferably New York, between the ages of 18, 19 to 32. But they don't watch TV, man. That's not who watches TV. They watch cop shows and they watch, you know, some things, but they don't do appointment viewing for the sitcom of the week. Your audience has to be married couples and families and middle America who've never been to a big city." And I said, they're watching Alf, Mork and Mindy. They're not watching Seinfeld. They won't know what we're talking about. So that's who I thought the audience was.
So George had a few memorable catchphrases. Do you remember any of them?
Things that came out of George's mouth?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I know the ones that get, you know, thrown back at me all the time. Shrinkage was a big one. Serenity Now is a big one. These pretzels are making me thirsty. That follows me around. Yada, yada, yada follows me around. Master of my domain, king of the castle, follows us all around. Can't stand ya. Oh, God, I know there's more. Jerk Store, the Jerk Store called. They're running out of you. I'm sure there's tons. They wrote me tons.
And who was Art Vandelay?
I wish we knew. Art Vandelay needs to reveal himself one day. Art Vandelay was actually a brilliant creation, and I think it's the second or third episode, where Jerry had met a girl at a dinner party, and all he knew about her was her first name and where she worked, the building she worked in. That's all he knew. And there was no way to contact her again. So George said, we'll stake out, oh, that was the episode, the stakeout. We'll stake out the lobby of the building she works in, and we'll just wait for her to come down, and you can play it off like, oh my God, I didn't know you work here, and then you'll have your second meeting. And so they're doing that, and as they're waiting, Jerry suddenly goes, wait a minute, what's our why are we here? What's our story? And in concocting this story, George comes up with, well, we're meeting somebody. Who are we meeting? Art Vandelay. Art Vandelay. And that became a recurrence for when George was unemployed, and they said, you know, are you seeking unemployment? I'm up for a job at Vandelay Industries. Vandelay just kept recurring. It became an ongoing lie, one of the many lies that spun out of George's mouth that he could retain and reuse as needed.
So let's talk about a typical week on Seinfeld. What was the production process like?
The only difference between the early years and the latter years was the amount of time it was done in. Initially, for the cast, it was a 5-day week that more or less truncated to a 4-day week as we went on. That was not because the show got easier to do. It was because the writers took more time to create the documents. And because of the success of the documents, we all went, do whatever you need to do. The mechanics of it were no different than any other 4-camera sitcom, live audience sitcom. I think, whatever, day one, was a table read. So all the producers, writers would be there, all the Castle Rock representatives would be there, all the NBC representatives would be there. We would read the script. They would go have a big powwow. They'd get their notes. Larry would quit. Then the notes would be thrown away. Larry would agree to stay for the day. And more often than not, the cast would go into a rehearsal mode. Even though we knew big chunks of the script were going to change, we would begin to stage the show. What was interesting about our process was, and this is not to diminish the contributions of any of our directors, because they were considerable, but our directors didn't stage the show. They didn't come up with business, which was really interesting, because the dynamic of the four of us, Julia and I were classically trained, but Julia's career had been more in sketch. Michael was a stand-up. He had had some formal training, but he was a stand-up and sketch and improv. Jerry had a little bit of training, but he was a stand-up. I had no improv, no sketch, but theater. So we have a lot of different disciplines colliding, and we would all approach material in a slightly different way and with slightly different priorities. And the four of us would get up, and we would go, because there was no, for the most part, there was no behavior indicated on the page, just dialogue. And we'd go, okay, well, what are we doing? What's going on? We can't just stand and talk. What are we doing? And it was very challenging because, much like Jerry's real life, the sets were minimal. His apartment set, you would never, if you knew you were doing a series for 9 years, you would never build that set. First of all, it was tiny. And there was nothing there. There was a couch and a table and a chair and a countertop and a desk way over there in kind of an inaccessible corner of the set, and then a bathroom door way up front and a front door. No tchotchkes, no, there was nothing there. Nothing to make you go, I'm going to go over there and do this. I'm going to go over here and play with this. I'm going to move here. I'm going to sit here. No, I'm going to sit here. I'm going to stand. So we would actually have to concoct reasons to be there and things to do. And the four of us would get up there and we'd start reading lines to each other and go, well, we can't just stand here. What are we going to do? So I'd say, all right, I just came in off the street. I'm gonna get something out of your refrigerator. And Jerry, you're just gonna go in my refrigerator? I go, yeah, that's what people do. They just, if you're friends, you go in the refrigerator. Okay. And then you go turn on the TV set for no reason, and you come in, and the four of us started kind of moving each other around and finding ways to use the space and use each other. And I think people talk about the four of us as a unique ensemble, and I agree. I think we were a very unique and chemically perfect ensemble. And I think it grew out of this, all right, you're stuck, let me help you. If you go over there, I can do this. And if I go over here, you can do that. That quickly became, you know what? This isn't as funny on me as it would be on Julia. Let Elaine do it. Or her going, well, actually, it's a Kramer move. Why doesn't he just... So instead of worrying so much about what am I going to do, our emphasis was on what are we going to do? Because the four of us can't just stand here and say this stuff. And in trying to figure out as a unit how we were going to make this thing live and breathe like people instead of a radio play, that ensemble energy formed. So we would spend the day doing that. We would do a run-through. Writers would come in. They would take their notes, rewrite overnight. We'd come back in, rehearse the new one, do the run-through. Big second day, big run-through for in-house producers, writers. Go home. They would write all night. We'd come back in on the third day with another revised script, put that up on its feet. That one started to become more or less the shape of the final script. So now we would start to invest in things a little more fully, knowing this is what we're going to have to make work. At the end of that run-through day, the network and Castle Rock would come down, and we'd do the run-through for them. And then cast would go home, and they would give their notes, and Larry would quit, and then their notes would be diminished, and Larry would come back. And Thursday began as, or day 4 began as is traditional, the camera block day. So that's the first day that the camera crew, the 4 cameras, would come in, and they had to learn their shots and their moves the same way we did. So on that day, we would be running scenes, the cameras would be given their assignments, and we would rehearse as a unit so that this could all be done seamlessly in front of an audience the next day. As we got more sophisticated, our show started to do a lot more location work, outside work. So day 4 became the outside day. We would either start and do quick camera blocking of the stuff that would happen on the stage and then go out and do our outside work for the rest of the day, or vice versa. And it became a long day. And then the last day was shoot day. So we would do a little refresh rehearsal, bring the audience in. Our shoots were unusual in that people always say, is there a laugh track on the Seinfeld episodes? The answer is yes, but not for what you think it is. Because of their integrity as comedians, Jerry and Larry would never put a laugh somewhere we didn't get one. But what you might do is you would see a blend of 2 different takes. So the sound of the laughter in take 1 is different from the sound of the laughter in take 2, but it's an immediate shot. So we're using Jerry's line from take 1 and my reaction from take 2. So they would use a laugh machine to blend the organic audience laugh and make it not jump. That's the only time they would use a laugh machine. But because of that integrity, we had some of the longest shoot nights ever, because if guaranteed laugh lines didn't get what they wanted, we had a live band. They'd put the band on. Everyone would circle onto the set, writers, cast, and we'd start pitching ideas. How do we make this better? What do we do? And if it took 5 minutes, it took 5 minutes. If it took 30 minutes, it took 30 minutes. And the greatest example of that is in The Marine Biologist. That final coffee shop scene was not in the show when we started taping. We started taping the episode, and we got to the last scene, and the audience had a very nonplussed reaction. It was a whole bunch of tee up. My story ended when I walked into the ocean. When we were on the beach, and somebody said, "Is there a marine biologist?" And I walked into the ocean. End of show. And we ran that piece of tape for the audience, and they liked it, but it wasn't wow. Writers circled the wagons, and 2 minutes later, Larry came over and he said, how quickly could you learn a monologue? I went, how many lines? He went, a page. I went, 10 minutes. He went, okay. And he wrote, "The sea was angry that day, my friends, and the golf ball and the blowhole." That was written in front of the audience. And the take that is on that episode is the first time we ever did it. We never rehearsed it. It just came out that way. And when that golf ball comes out of my pocket, that was one of the longest sustained laughs we ever got in a live taping. That laugh went for more than a minute before Michael could go. Is that a Titleist? Hole in one. So that's how diligent they were about, if it wasn't working yet, they would make it work. So the tape nights could go very long.
And what was the impact of having that studio audience there, and especially for you as a theater actor? Did that add an energy for you that you fed off of?
The studio audience definitely adds an energy. It's a tricky thing. It's a tricky thing for both sides. When you're first coming on the air and nobody knows who your show is, those audiences are brought in from the tour groups that are going around town. They don't know you. They don't know your show. All they know is their voice will be on TV. So the guy warming up the audience goes, "Let's hear a big laugh. Let's hear a little laugh. Let's hear a titter. Okay." And then, you do every scene 3-4 times in front of an audience. And you'll hear them say, just before the second take, "All right, laugh as big as the way you did the first time." So sometimes you're going, oh, for God's sakes, this is not a real audience. And it can be a pain in the ass. When you know you're getting a real laugh from the real live audience, yes, that's fantastic. That's what you're working for. And they tell you a lot. I was thrown because that audience comes in, they're about 100 feet away from you in the viewing stands. And between you and them is a wall of technology. It's all the cameras and everything else. So if they wanted to watch the show that's happening down on the stage, they can't see it very well. There's a lot of stuff in their way. So they watch up on the monitor that's on. They're watching TV. There's a live show going on in front of them. They're watching TV. And there's someone called a camera switcher who is, the picture going up on that monitor is being switched between the 4 cameras from the live feed by someone in the booth. It's their best guess. That's not the final edit. It's their best guess as to what picture to put up there to get the reaction from the audience. Sometimes they guess right, sometimes they guess wrong. But it's a very strange thing to be playing for a live audience that's not watching you. It's also a strange thing as a theater actor to be 100 feet from the audience, which is more than they would ever be in the theater. Your front row is 10 feet from you. But you got a wall of cameras. So do you play the character for the viewing audience? In which case I feel like I should be throwing things back, but that's too big for the cameras. Or do you play for the camera and go, do they even see what I'm doing? So it was a big learning curve for me. It took a long time.
And what about censorship? Did you face any censorship that you were aware of while you were shooting?
I'm sure we did. I wouldn't be in on those conversations. We knew there was going to be a battle royale over the masturbation show. And we kept hearing there's a show about masturbation coming, and we went, that'll never get here because there's no way. But no, we got away. I think for the time that we were shooting the show, we got away with a lot. And also, you have to remember, it was Jerry's sensibility. Jerry works clean. Jerry doesn't believe in the cheap laugh, the easy laugh. He wants to find the word the other guy wouldn't have thought of. So we didn't have too many problems with that.
You had mentioned earlier that if it didn't feel organic to George, you wouldn't do it. Was there anything specifically that you remember that you said, no, I'm not going to, George wouldn't do that, I'm not going to do that?
No. There were 2 times where I confronted Larry with a problem. And in retrospect, I'm not terribly proud of either one of them, but as I say, when Julia first came onto the show, I was a little threatened by that because I thought the 3-person show had become a 4-person show, and I really thought she and I were 2 sides of the same coin, and I wasn't sure if that was going to be interesting. And I had no fantasies about a television career. I was a theater guy, so this was a detour for me. I didn't know if it was going to have longevity, but as long as I was doing something that I was having a great time with, I was fine taking this detour. And now this chick is on my set. And sure enough, within 4 episodes, they wrote an episode that Michael and I were not in. It was Jerry and Elaine going to Florida. Very good episode, by the way. But there was no organic way for George and Kramer to be in that episode. And so Michael and I had a week off, and I came back in the following week, and we did the table read for the next episode, and then I went to Larry's office. I said, I got to talk to you. I said, I totally get it. I get it. It was a great episode. I said, if you don't need me to be here every week, I don't want to be here. So if you write me out again, do it permanently. And Larry went, what? What are you talking? Do you know what it is to find stories for 4 characters? And he's right. He's absolutely right. I mean, I can only imagine the hurdles you have to leap. But I was what I was. And I went, don't tell me your problems. I'm telling you, if you don't need me to be here, if I'm not vital to every episode of this show, I don't want to be here. I don't want to do this. And they never did it to me again. They did it to Michael again, but they never did it to me again. So that was my one confrontation. And then another one was...
Wait, can I ask, did you mean it? Were you bluffing, or did you
I
really
was not
mean
bluffing. The show was not an issue. The show, nobody was watching the show. This was not going to be a thing. I could go back to New York and do what I wanted to do. I still had my apartment in New York. My wife is, we've turned our life upside down to come be in Los Angeles because I'm going to be the number 2 guy on this show, and now they're writing me out of episodes. They paid me, and they said, we gave you a week off. You got paid to do nothing. I went, I'm not interested in that. I was a little bit of a jerk. The other episode was an episode called The Briss. The version of it that came to the table, the character of the Moyle was disgusting. I think it remains disgusting in the show that we did, but it was, you got to go a long way to hit my Jew button. I give you Jews are funny, and you can be really sacrilegious with me, and I'll take every Jew joke you got, even the borderline offensive ones. To a non-Jew, the whole practice of the circumcision, the bris, is mysterious and kind of distasteful, and to present the figure of the Moyle, the person who goes, I'm going to be the guy, my life's work is going to be to remove the foreskin from the genitals of young Jewish boys. That's what I devote my life to, is already a person of questionable character to the non-Jew. And to make one who is a child-hating, self-loathing, foul-mouthed, incompetent, to me was anti-Semitic in a hurtful way. And I went to Larry and I went, I won't be in this episode. This one you have to take me out of. I have to boycott this. And I said, you listen, exactly what I said to you. I'm up for every Jew joke you've got. This is an offense. And he didn't see it at first, and then he said, I'm going to soften it. I'm going to soften it. And I went, okay. And I still think it was, I'm not proud of that episode at all. I'm not proud of that portrayal. And I don't think it was a particularly good element in an otherwise pretty good episode. But those are the only two.
So let's talk about working with Larry. What was it like to work with him in general?
It was great. It's so funny. Seinfeld was not an emotional set for the most part. Surely, it is now legendary, over the writer's door in Latin, there was a phrase that meant no hugging, no learning. This was not a show where characters grow, where we learn things, life lessons. And that was reflected throughout every element of the show. We were a cast that was constantly, joyously, affectionately digging at each other. So much laughter, but we were not a group. We were not a social group, which is why we don't see much of each other now. We didn't shoot a show on Friday and go, hey, let's have dinner tomorrow night. We went, see you Monday. So we had no history after 9 years of socializing, and therefore we didn't immediately dump into a future of socializing. But I think Larry knows that I have an affection for him that maybe other people wouldn't normally have. It was my job to see everything about him that was magnificent and dear and wonderful and use it. And so I watched him carefully. And I think he knows that. I also tell people, right or wrong, because neither Julia, Michael, nor I really can tell you the behind-the-scenes stories of the show. We didn't spend much time there. But for my sensibility, based on what I saw when I was there, and my observations about the 7 years Larry was running the show and the 2 years he was not, I think the Seinfeld show was more Larry's show than Jerry's show. I think Larry's sensibilities carried and dictated more of the directions we took than Jerry's. And I've said that before. And whether he'll admit it or not, I think Larry appreciates that. I think he agrees with that. And I don't think most people think that. Because Jerry was all over it. And that is not to negate Jerry's contribution at all. Jerry, every cell of that show comes out of Jerry. But I kind of praise Larry in a way that I'm not sure most other people do. And so I have as close to an affectionate relationship with Larry as anyone in the Seinfeld milieu is going to was going to have with him. And I found working with him kind of great. It was like dealing with a family member. I worked with the most difficult man in the world when I worked with Jerry Robbins, and I was unafraid. So I was unafraid of Larry David. And I think that was kind of fun for him. It was just kind of fun.
So talk about working with Jerry.
Jerry Seinfeld? Also, a blast. In retrospect, it's so interesting to me because I spent a goodly amount of time with Jerry. I don't really know him very well. Jerry appears to be really open, and I know a lot about Jerry, but there's so much more that I don't know. And I'm often surprised by things he will do, won't do, will say, won't say. His generosity to us on the show was extraordinary. It was designed to be his show. It's not his show. It was our show. It was the three of us. He gave the best stuff away. He set the tone on the stage, and that tone was dedication. We rehearsed like fiends, more than any other show I've ever visited. We took our rehearsal time seriously. We wanted everything as good and as creative and as imaginative and as fulfilling as we could get. We would do scenes over and over and over, looking for another nuance, another nuance. That comes from Jerry's work ethic. A generous set, a funny set, a communal set. Yes, there was Jerry and then there's us, but he didn't lean on that when we were there. And so it was a joyous set to work on because of Jerry. In the latter years, when our negotiations were up and we got into a very difficult business situation, we had an essential disagreement with Jerry that challenged that relationship. I am thrilled to tell you that as in the worst parts of it, at times where we were really not happy with each other, it never came on the stage. When we got on to work on the stage, it was the same energies, the same relationships, the same joys, the same amount of laughter. The business was one thing, and the work was another. And the work was always joyous and fun and purposeful. And that was a great situation. There are sets that you work on that are really fun, and you go, don't you care about what we're doing anymore? You're walking through this. Yeah, we're having a great time, but we're not doing our jobs. We did our jobs, and that was because of the tones and the mandates that Jerry set. So he was a great guy to work for and with.
You mentioned your initial reaction to Julia, but how did your relationship evolve?
She and I am closer to Julia than I am to anyone else on the show, for a number of reasons. I think our sensibilities as people are very similar. We care about similar things. Our lives mirrored each other more than everybody else. We were the married two. She was in a long-term relationship. I was in a long-term relationship. We had our babies at exactly the same time. When my wife was pregnant, Julia was pregnant. Our kids are months apart from each other. Julia and I worked on North, a movie together. We did readings of Gilda Radner's book, Bunny Bunny, as benefits in New York. So we had done other things outside of the show together. She is the only member of the four of us with whom I have socialized one-on-one. So I adore her. And the truth is, I don't think I was ever competitive, really, with anybody on the show. I should have been with Michael, because he was the guy that kept beating me out for Emmys. But I was never competitive with Michael or anyone on the show. But considering she was the only one I had a moment of competitiveness with, she is the one that I embrace the most. And her career post-Seinfeld is the most notable of the four of us. And I'm the biggest cheerleader going, you go, girl. She's extraordinary. And in fact, knowing her the way I do, the things that she has succeeded in don't begin to tap what's there. They're only a piece of what she can do. So I'm a big fan.
And what about Michael?
Michael was fascinating to work with. It was a learning curve with Mike because Michael's approach to things are so different from anything I had experienced. He was a wild, character-driven sketch guy with some formal training and some formal experience. But the way he approaches things, the work, was very, very different from anything I had ever experienced. And immediately I loved it because in the beginning, the relationship between George and Kramer is one of George going, why is this man who's clearly insane constantly in this apartment? It was supposed to be looking at him, sort of never taking your eye off and worrying that he would pick up a knife and kill you, not trusting him. So the natural sort of off-kilteredness that I had by working with Mike, we just incorporated into everything. But I quickly began to see what Michael was doing and so admired it and learned from it. What Michael did with Kramer is one of the most subtle, powerful reinventions of anything I'd ever seen. That was written to be a one scene per show, throwaway role, the crazy, dumb neighbor next door. Got it. We've seen it 100 times. Yes, Michael has an interesting spin on it, but that's what it is. That's all it's ever going to be. Michael, instead of playing the dumbest guy in the room, decided he's the smartest guy in the room. And he, by refusing to fall into the caricature they thought he was going to give them, by never quite saying the words that Larry wrote, he would miss them, or he'd mispronounce things, or he'd rephrase them. He showed them who Kramer could be. And in fact, opened up a world of possibility to the point where I think Kramer is the show. Kramer is the most unique element of the show. I've never seen a character like him. Right down to the how do you come through the door? Entrance applause on coming through the door. Which he eventually said, you got to make the audience stop doing that. I can't play the scene. I'm coming in to do something, and I got to wait for the applause. So Michael would always surprise us. Here's a perfect Michael example. So my entree into the Directors Guild was in Seinfeld. They allowed me to apprentice and then ultimately direct an episode. And the episode I directed, the Kramer storyline, was that he was having epileptic-like seizures at the sound of Mary Hart's voice. And Kramer had to have a seizure in one of the scenes. So I said to Michael, Mike, what do you want to do? And, we'll set it up. How big do you want to go? And what do where do you want to be? How much of your body do you want us to see? Is less more? Is more less? How do you, talk to me. What do you want to do? I want to go very real on this. I think I'm behind the couch. I'll shake and I'll fall behind the couch, and maybe you'll see my legs twitch or something. But I don't want to be grotesque about it. This is what he says to me. And for 4 days, that's what he's doing. Okay. We get in front of the audience. Take one. He destroyed the set. The dining room table, the little dining table, cracked that in half. The bookshelf above the dining table, pulled it over. Stuff went everywhere. Audiences howling. And I go, dude, we're screwed. We've just lost the set. We're only halfway through the show. Why didn't you tell me? That's Michael. He didn't know. And so much preparation went into every rehearsal of how he was going to do that fit. Every jiggle, every sound. But ultimately, he didn't know what he was going to do. That's Michael. And when you're working with somebody who does that much intensive preparation and still doesn't know what he's going to do, you're on your toes. You don't know what's going to happen.
How was TV Jerry different from real life Jerry?
I mean, Jerry himself used to say, I come in a pair of jeans, I take them off, and I put on a pair of jeans. So, not terribly. I mean, you know, it was based on his sensibilities. They're not really, there really isn't any kind of a glaring difference I could point to. I mean, Jerry is smarter and a little more sophisticated in his ranges of experiences that he can talk about, and he is more willing to talk about things in a serious manner. I don't think you ever see the real serious side of Jerry in our show. But the day-to-day attitude and demeanor of him, same thing.
So you mentioned earlier the actors that were cast as your parents on the show. Can you talk a bit about them?
Well, Estelle Harris, I believe, made her first appearance in the masturbation contest. And she showed up for that table read. First of all, she looks a lot like my actual mother. My mother's a little short, squat, round lady with red hair. And she was heaven. I mean, the sound of her voice, George, coming out of that little tiny body, it's instant comedy. And I went, oh, now we understand who George is. Stiller was the third guy to play my dad. It began with John Randolph, the actor from Broadway Bound, who would never memorize his lines, who I loved to death, but John actually looked more like my grandfather than my father. So we did an episode with him. That wasn't right. And then there was another actor that came in. I can't remember who it was. He did an episode, half a scene. Wasn't noteworthy. And then there was a big episode for the Costanzas, and Jerry Stiller finally showed up. And he's my favorite character on the show. What Jerry brought to that show, he doesn't even know how good he is. He actually probably thinks he was a failure on the show because a lot of the Frank Costanza character came from Jerry's concern about memorizing lines. He put so much concern on this, and he had so many different techniques for learning them that they actually got in his way. And what would happen is he would come into every scene not quite sure if he knew what the hell he was doing. And the lines would come back to him in little stutter steps. So they would come out in little stutter steps, and what you were seeing was his growing anxiety and frustration with his own memory that got translated into the just disdain for the world that Frank Costanza had. So, are you telling me that we can't go to Down Bunker? I mean, he would never have read the line that way. It came out because of what was going on in his head. And it was glorious. And he would apologize after every take. I can do it better, I can do it. And we're rolling. We're on the floor rolling. In the first episode that he came in with, there was something I wanted him to do to show his disdain for George. I was standing by the kitchen door in our Costanza house, and he had to pass me in the little door frame. I said, as you go by, take the palm of your hand and just hit my head, and I'm going to use that momentum to bang my head on the door. And you just keep going. And he went, oh, I can't do that. I'll hurt you. I go, you can't hurt me. You can't hurt this part of my head, Jerry. Don't worry. An hour. To get, I would go, hit me. You know, he is the sweetest, kindest, gentlest, most grateful, lovely, smart, soulful guy at playing this disaster of a human being. The two of them together were magic. And any scene I was in with them, I could literally go, I could kick off my shoes and go, all I got to do is stand in the middle. They're doing all the heavy lifting because anybody that's watching me between these two idiots knows exactly why George is George. It was the gift that kept on giving.
Earlier, you also mentioned George's fiancée.
Susan.
Yes. Can you talk about Heidi?
Oh, I've done such disservice to Heidi over the years. It's so sad. Heidi is a lovely girl, and I've actually reacquainted myself with Heidi of late, and I'm even more impressed with who she is as a human being. She's a lovely person. Heidi was cast not on her ability as an actress, which is not to say that she's not a good actress. She's a fine actress. But she was cast because she looked like an actual person at NBC in a role that was supposed to be one line and never heard from again. When we did the pitch of the pilot in the show, she looked like an NBC executive that had been in the room when Jerry and Larry pitched it. She was hired for that look. And then George makes some reference after he has imploded in the room and made a fool of himself, and Jerry's chastising him for it at the reception desk. He goes, I think the girl liked me. She was the girl. Somehow, that became enough for this connective tissue to make her the girl that George was going to have a relationship with. So now, what had been a look-alike casting now is, well, you're the girl. For whatever reason, I, Jason, found Heidi's comedy instincts to be the opposite of mine. So whatever I was trying to get going in a scene, I always felt like I was punching into Jell-O. I couldn't get the right responses back. I'm sure she felt the same way, but she's the guest. She's not going to complain about me, so poor thing. And so I would go, okay, well, she's doing that. Let me switch this. Let me try and do this. And either I would switch and Larry would go, don't do that. Don't do what you were doing. Or I would switch and then she'd do something else. So I'd go, I can't find a path with her. I can't. I'm always off. I'm just off trying to play against this actress. I don't know why. It was not that she was doing anything wrong. It was literally a chemical problem. And then Larry goes, she's going to be your fiance? And I went, you're killing me. I don't know how to work with her. It's not that I don't know how to work with her as a human being. I don't know how to work with her as an actress. I just feel like we don't have it for each other. And he went, that's why. It's great. He said, what happens is we're neither rooting for you guys or against you guys. And that's what Larry wanted. And then, so we made do. I mean, she certainly, I don't know how she felt about me. I've never asked her. And I certainly would never have said to her, honey, you're killing me. But it was very, I found it very difficult and challenging to play scenes off of her. And there were times when I would be very vocal about that with the gang and go, I got to tell you guys, it's tough. I know you're having a fun time. You're laughing. And the scenes, I guess, are playing. I just got to tell you, I'm way off kilter every time we do stuff. And they're like, oh, she's great. You're great together. It's Burns and Allen, blah, 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 you know. And then finally they had to do a big scene with her. And they had a similar problem. And that's when we decided to kill her. That's how that decision got made. Because they didn't know when we started that season, was I going to marry her? Was she going to leave me? Was I going to leave her? Those are the only three possibilities, right? That's the only... They found a fourth. Sorry, Heidi. I have to say, because I know this is being archived, I really do like Heidi. I really do. I think she's a lovely person. I've had wonderful conversations with her, and she is kind and generous and talented. I've seen her do other things where I thought, that's really good. There was something in the dynamic between her as Susan and me as George. I couldn't ever comfortably find my way. And it created something wonderful. So maybe that's exactly what it was meant to be.
Oh. Did you guys do a lot of publicity for the show?
Fair amount. I mean, I know, I remember the big things, the Rolling Stone cover and the Entertainment Weekly cover, and as individuals, we were all over the talk show circuits, and, Jerry was out doing stand-up, and we did a fair amount, but after season 3, there wasn't a huge need to. It was doing its own thing, so I don't think we over-publicized it, but, we all worked as hard as we could to get it to the point where it was a known quantity.
Was that a coordinated effort among the 4 of you, or?
There was an NBC publicist that would coordinate. We each had our own publicists because we were all looking out for ourselves. On the chance that the show didn't survive, we were going to use it to launch our own careers. But our publicists all coordinated under the show's publicists, so it was coordinated to some degree. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that you and Michael were frequently up against each other
For
Emmy Awards. Did it bother you never winning?
That would be phrasing it too strongly. I note it. I note that I never won it. I note that I'm the only one of the 4 to never win one. If I said to you, my life's dream was to win an Emmy Award, I would be lying. I never had my eye on that prize. I also don't really believe in prizes for acting. I don't think there's a way to compare an actor's work in one role against another actor's work in a completely different role. Now, if the competition was all 5 of you are going to play the same role, now we're talking about a competition. But we're not doing that. So the competition is really for who got the best role, most of the time. I also knew Michael really wanted it. It was important. The way I felt about the Tony, he felt about the Emmy. And I always worried if I did win this when I was nominated against him, would it sit okay with him? Because he really wanted it. And I know he was disappointed every time he didn't get it. I also can tell you, forget that I'm a Seinfeld member. I believe I lost 3 times to David Hyde Pierce and 3 times to Michael. I love David Hyde Pierce. I think he's a terrific actor. I have no problems losing to David Hyde Pierce. I am amazed that Michael didn't win it every time. Because, having said what I said about it's really a competition for who got the best role, well, I think I do a glorious job as George. I think David Hyde Pierce does a glorious job in Frasier. And the other actors in our category do glorious jobs as well. But if you take all of us, take Michael out of the mix, we're all playing kind of wonderful, eccentric, odd character roles. Usually some smart lines, some behaviors, blah, blah, blah. Fine. It's really, toss a coin, which one makes you laugh the most? And then there's Kramer, who is unlike anything else the rest of us ever had to do. He is creating things out of thin air. Every one of the roles in the category could have been played by dozens of other actors with very little diminishment of the role. I can't think of another actor that could have accomplished Kramer the way Michael did. So if you're really looking about a competition, every time I got nominated against him, I went, it's like being nominated against, Olivier for a dramatic role. I can't beat that. That is singular. Nobody else can do that. You could put Wayne Knight in my role, and you'd get a funny, good, great George. Who do you put in Kramer's role? So for me, anytime I go, oh, the Emmy, I go, yeah, but geez. How did I even get nominated when that was existing? They should have just gone, in the supporting category, we're just going to give it to Michael Richards. That's what should have happened.
Excellent. We're going to stop and change tapes.
All right. Bored yet?